This is a writing-intensive course, which means you have to do a lot of writing. And, it's actually, I've been teaching the course like this for a long time, even before it became a writing-intensive course. So it made sense to do it this way. And come on in.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Because it's an online course and it's writing intensive, I'm allowed to have 3 graders who help out. They will read your papers and grade your papers and comment on your papers, and they're very good. Actually, Karen Cheney, who is in the back of the room, comes every week, and she not only took this course about, 10 years ago? More than that? Okay, as a student here, but she's been grading in it pretty much since then. Got her master's at the Extension School. Also has a master's from Berkeley? I'm sorry. No, you don't have a master's. Loyola Marymount. Okay, even better. And very good writer, critic of writing. Critic not in the sense that she just criticizes everything you do, but thinks of ways to help. So if you come to class, she's the one you should give your papers to. If you are an online student, you can send your papers to one of the 2 distance graders, Chris Libertini, who is a BC PhD, teaches, actually his specialty is medieval history, but he's also been critiquing a lot of writing for me over the years. He teaches at Dominican College outside of New York, or Patrick O'Brien, who is actually a lawyer and a very good writer. Send them, papers to them. They will write comments, grade them. If you have a problem with one of the graders, come to me, and I'll be happy to try to resolve it. And if you're a graduate student, send your stuff to me, and I will read it. I'm sorry, I don't have as much time. Or I don't want to say I'm really a busy person. I'm really much lazier than the 3 graders, and so I tend to put things off, even though I enjoy reading papers and thinking about them. I'm not as good at responding as I should be, but keep pressing me, and I will. So that's how, that works as far as the graders go. And Karen is here every week. She's also happy to meet with you to talk about your papers, talk about writing, and so on. Now, we require there are 3 graded papers you will do. Longer, no less than 3 pages, no more than 8 pages on some topic. have a series of questions throughout the semester on different topics we will be discussing that should help you to think about the material. I'm not simply asking you to tell me what happened with the Compromise of 1850. I have the questions here because it's a good way to get a paper going, is by answering a question, as opposed to just narrating something that happened. Why did something happen? Who did what? These kinds of questions really are what drives our inquiries. So that's why I have these questions that you can focus on. Another question may occur to you. Some issue comes up in the course of your reading or of our discussions, and you think that would be interesting. Then you can look into it. The questions are there as guides, not as the mandates. So think of them in that way. Also, every other week, I ask you to do an ungraded 1-page memo, which actually, I hope by next week, I actually have a site on the website where you can send these. Just put them in, then other people can comment on them, and it should be very interesting and a lot of fun. So if you are, let me just say, if you're a distance student and you're submitting your papers by email, make sure you put your email address on the paper itself, as well as your name, because the first thing that's going to happen when I get an email and I get a paper attached, I disconnect them, so I have a stack of papers then in another file, and then if I can't figure out whose paper it is, I'm really in trouble, as will the graders be. Okay, so hopefully next week we'll have a place on the website where you can send things to, as well as bringing them to class, sending them by email, or doing these other things. Does anyone have any questions so far on any of this? The 1-page memos are meant to give you an opportunity to raise a question, think about something, try to clarify something in your own mind. I tell you this and say we're not going to be hypercritical, but then the graders start reading them and they become hypercritical and people get really sad and disillusioned, and I don't want that to happen, although maybe it's inevitable. maybe I've spent too much time with Hobbes and Defoe. Anyway, so we have lots of different issues we'll be talking about over the course of the semester. I proceed chronologically because I'm an historian. And so there may be things you're really interested in, say the Civil War. We will get to that eventually. Okay? I think the period around the 1780s is the most important period. I might spend too much time on that. If you find me spending too much time on something, let me know. Tell me to speed it up. Or tell me to skip James Madison. You really want to hear about John C. Calhoun. Does anyone want to hear more about John C. Calhoun, by the way? Okay, one person does. Why is that?
Because I'm from Charleston, South Carolina.
You're from Charleston, South Carolina. Okay. We may ask you for your thoughts on John C. Calhoun then. Okay. I've assigned one textbook, which is really the standard book on American constitutional history by Alfred Kelly, Winifred Harbison, and Herman Bells, The American Constitution, Its Origins and Development. And it's a useful book. If you do want to go on, if one day you're on the Supreme Court, say, it's the kind of book you would like to have on your shelf. I'm looking around seeing a number of people who might wind up on the Supreme Court, so I'm glad I'm having you read Kelly, Harbison, and Bells. In addition, we have lots of cases we'll be reading. And the cases you can get in libraries, you can get many of them on websites, and they're, well, has anyone read a Supreme Court case before? Okay, a few people, actually a good number of people have read Supreme Court cases, so you kind of know how to read them. We'll also be reading a lot, well, there's a lot of politics going on in this whole period, that is between the 1780s and the 1850s. And remember, this is something to remember as we're reading this stuff. These are all big arguments. Arguments in which people would stake their lives. And you may agree or disagree, and that's good. Nothing happens inevitably. And just remember, today we have big issues on which people are staking their lives, and one day there will be a class very much like this considering things that we find to be burning issues, and the students will have the same dazed looks you have when I bring up, say, the Compromise of 1850 or something as mundane as that. You know, just remember, these are burning issues, and people have different opinions. I remember once actually working with a group of school teachers, and I had them read some of the arguments for and against ratifying the Constitution. And I thought it was pretty straightforward, that these guys really disagreed with each other. The teacher said, oh, well, I think they both kind of said the same thing. One said, if we ratify the Constitution, we will all be chained and dragged into slavery. And the other said, unless we ratify the Constitution, the country will fall apart. Now, those I thought were pretty clear that they had different points of view. Is anyone here a teacher, by the way? Okay, good.
You need terrible students.
Yeah, I think the same reason college professors do. Yeah. We're the smartest one in the room.
We don't listen.
That's right, we don't. Even by interrupting you, as you were saying we don't listen, I was saying we don't listen, you know, so. So teachers make terrible students. Incidentally, college professors make terrible political figures because we like to lecture, and that's not what people want. Good politicians are good listeners. So, again, this is getting us off onto a tangent for which I apologize, and I'll start calling people names. Anyway. I have found a couple of websites where you can find a lot of these Supreme Court cases. There's LexisNexis, which maybe not all of you can get, but a lot of the bigger cases you can find in other places. The Supreme Court has a very good website where you can find a lot of these things. And then there's a website put together by a group of students in the Netherlands with lots of American history documents on it. And then there's a group called the Constitution Society that has this great website, constitution.org, where they have all of the Federalist and Anti-Federalist arguments. This is one of the big debates in the history of the country. Should the Constitution be ratified? And a lot of lively stuff. Has anyone read any of this stuff, by the way? The Federalist or Anti-Federalist arguments? Yes, what have you read?
I had an American history class we read just
Okay, yeah. See, here's a problem, and we have just one person who admits to being a teacher. We make people read The Federalist, these classic essays by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay. Has anyone read this, by the way? A number of years ago, Harvard faculty were polled on what their favorite pleasure reading is, and a surprising number listed The Federalist. And I just can't picture it. I think the Harvard faculty probably try to impress one another with their erudition. In the Houghton Library, there is an edition of The Federalist, 1788 edition, so it's the first printing of it, that belonged to Thomas Jefferson and to James Monroe, as well as to George Ticknor, the 19th century historian. And one of them, or maybe someone else, wrote inside the back leaf in pencil, a disquietingly dry book. And there are some interesting pieces in it, but the important thing to remember, just as it's important to remember Locke is writing in response to Filmer, these are written to convince people, and they're written as part of an argument. And if we only read The Federalist, we're only reading half of the argument. It's like listening to half of a telephone conversation. And you miss this debate. Even at the time, even in 1787-88, these weren't considered the most crucial parts of the debate. The really important Federalist writings were by people like James Wilson, a Philadelphia lawyer, or Oliver Wolcott from Connecticut, or Roger Sherman from Connecticut. You know, these are the guys who really are making the argument, the arguments people are quoting. And the much more lively debate is happening on the other side. The warnings about what will happen if this thing is enacted. And you have all kinds of interesting stuff by people like Melancton Smith from New York, or James Winthrop, who's a Harvard guy, and writes this series of really passionate essays about warning what's going to happen if, we're put into a union with Pennsylvania, and where people can believe whatever they want and can hold office. Imagine the Constitution doesn't have a religious test, Winthrop warned, so anyone, even a papist or a Mohammedan, could become president of the United States. And you have this really interesting stuff. Mercy Otis Warren, also from Massachusetts, writes this really lively pamphlet. And then you have the debates in the state conventions, which are fascinating, where people are arguing point by point about the Constitution. We'll spend a class or so talking about the Constitutional Convention of 1787, but James Madison said later that if you really wanted to understand the meaning of the Constitution, you wouldn't look at the records of the convention. You would look at these state ratifying conventions where each clause of the Constitution was held up to scrutiny. People argued about it, and people explained what they thought it meant. Very interesting political process in 1787 and 88, ratifying the Constitution. And all of that is on this website the Constitution Society has put together. And it's great stuff. Now, the Constitution Society seems to have some kind of political agenda. I haven't quite figured out what it is, so I'm not asking you to endorse whatever it is they're about. Anyway, maybe just they like the Constitution, which is a worthy enough thing. But read the documents, because that's really where you find the argument. And remember, all of this is argument, and there may be issues that resonate today, there may be things that don't, but I'm really much more interested in history than I am in current events. So if I start reading a paper and you've decided what you really want to write about is some current issue, I'm simply not going to read the paper. Okay? I have opinions too. They're really not germane to all of this. All of this should inform our opinions about things today. I once had students complain that some students in the class were taking it as their own personal forum on the First Amendment. So I'm all for free speech, but anyway, I apologize for not being for free speech, but I realize it's not free since you all are paying for this and you're wondering where I'm going with this. Okay, so that's what we will be doing. You have these readings from the textbook, from these websites, or other books available, and if you come across something, let me know. Okay? Any questions then? I think I've pretty much covered everything. So then we have the textbook. It's pretty straightforward. We have a number of cases we will be talking about, political issues we will be talking about, and a lot of really interesting stuff. And we do break around the time of the Civil War, and after the Civil War everything changes, which is why next year I plan to offer part 2, which tells us what happened since the 14th Amendment. And if your real interest is what happened since the 14th Amendment, let me tell you, the first period is really a lot more interesting. So don't leave and say, okay, I'll come back next year when you're talking about the interesting stuff. This is really the interesting stuff that really informs much of what happens today. Now, as far as your grades go, each paper counts for about 25%, and then participation, that is, you submit stuff and you participate in online discussions, that's another 25%. You're allowed to rewrite papers. Keep it within some reason. The graders, a couple of the graders have complained about students who keep rewriting things. There aren't that many people who keep rewriting things, so, and since I don't keep reading them, I don't find it a big problem. So I'm sorry, Karen. Karen isn't one who complains about anything. So, so you're allowed to rewrite things. I tell you, it's easier to take a paper that gets, say, a D or a C and make it into a good paper than it is to take a paper that gets a B plus and make it into an A paper for some reason. I'm not quite sure why that is. So usually the comments are there to help. And just because sometimes people wonder what it is we're looking for, I've actually given you a list of things we're looking for in different papers that differentiate an A paper from a B paper from a C paper and so on. It'll just help you. You can look at your paper and see, okay. I used to be much more subjective and say, well, I really like this guy, so I'm going to give his papers good grades. No, I didn't think like that. But, there are certain things we find in an A paper that it's original, that the person is really thinking, and it's interesting to read. Those are the basic things. Now, everyone thinks when they write something, it's original and it's interesting. It's not always the case. So we also look for proper format of paragraphs, grammatical structure. All of this stuff is as it should be. And an opening paragraph that explains where you're going. This is something we'll talk about as you're writing, too. Also, you'll use the relevant sources and not just write this off the top of your head. You may be a native genius and don't need to rely on sources, but it's really how history works, is by relying on sources, not simply passing off opinions. Excuse me? Okay. So, use sources, cite them properly with footnotes or endnotes, which I prefer to parenthetical citations. Does everyone know? I don't want to scare people by saying I want you to use footnotes. And lawyers actually cite things differently. Are you scared of footnotes?
No, I was just wondering, it says, in terms of formatting,
yeah.
Do you have a preference, like, should it be double-spaced, font?
It should be double-spaced. I don't care what kind of font you use, how big the margins are, that kind of thing. Double spacing just makes it easier to read. Okay? That's the only reason. Then, for example, Karen can write comments on it more easily than if it's single-spaced. And no, I don't care. I'm not going to measure the, margins and so on. Paragraphs, typically you should have a sentence that tells you what the paragraph is about and then does whatever it is. I don't like papers that start off by saying, in this paper I will attempt to prove that. There are ways of starting a paper that are better, and so you should, by the time you've written the paper, know that either it does prove it or doesn't. And so don't say I'm going to attempt to do something, because by the time you're writing this, you should have done it. No, if you've done it or not. I've never read a paper that says, in this paper I was going to try to prove this, but I wound up actually proving something else or proving myself wrong. So you have quotes or relying on sources. And if you use a quote, explain what it means. Because when I see a big block of text that you're quoting, I immediately skip it. Because as I mentioned, I'm really a lazy person, because I expect you to then to explain what this means and why you went to the trouble of picking out this particular quote. And, you really proofread it so you don't have a lot of typographical errors, which happen. People make mistakes. I'm not saying you can't have any typographical errors, but if I see a paper that has typographical errors, I think, boy, the person didn't spend a lot of time proofreading, and that's a bad sign. So those are kinds of the things we're looking for, not only that you understand the material, but you're engaged with it. Now, I know sometimes it's hard to whip up a lot of enthusiasm for, you may not be as enthusiastic with Federalist 51 as I am, but at least try, okay? And don't simply, we can get you into the things not to do, particularly after you start writing papers. Now, so A papers are really pretty good, okay? Quite good. Sometimes I stand up and applaud when I'm finished reading them. Or if I think, boy, I couldn't have written that. That's really a good sign. Again, we're talking about lots of arguments. There are some issues here which are still quite relevant. Issues of power, issues of the role of the state. You may have a different point of view than I do. In fact, every time I teach the course, I'm on a different side about whether or not the Constitution should have been ratified. And so I am not going to hold it against you if you happen to disagree with me. If you can rely on, reasonable sources and not just say, I've always hated Hamilton, therefore I know he was wrong. Or, Jefferson was really a jerk, so I can't believe his arguments about the constitutionality of the bank. You have to have some reason for saying things other than simply, not liking the way someone cut his hair. Actually, John Adams wrote a really interesting thing about the difference between the Jefferson and Adams administration, and the way they cut their hair was one of the things. We'll get to that later on. B papers are really pretty good. That is, you did a good job. I'm not saying there's something necessarily missing. It has all the same conventions as an A paper and shows you understand the material. It's based on the sources. There may be some paragraphs that are too long or too short. There may be more grammatical errors or some weakness in it that keeps it from being an A paper. I'm not saying, and sometimes, yes, you clean up those things, it turns it into an A paper. Use more quotes, cite things better, develop your argument better. Okay? Paper in the C range, okay, the person has given it some thought, but not enough. Isn't using enough sources. Hasn't really thought things through as closely as the person should, hasn't really researched it, there will be errors and so on in it. But still, there's evidence that the person at least has a little familiarity with the topic. And usually, these are the papers on which there will be more comments, okay? Because you're here to learn, and we're here to teach, and so this is an area where we can help. Papers in the D range don't really do enough with the sources, doesn't really show evidence. And again, what we're looking for is evidence that you've really thought about this, have really researched this, and didn't just write this on the T on the way to class, which people sometimes do. And you might have some point, but you don't really develop it. Or it might be completely irrelevant to whatever it is we're talking about. And so that's really what we're looking for. Because it's a writing-intensive class, and because we're here to help you with your writing, don't procrastinate. We have due dates for the papers, and don't think, boy, if I just have another week, this will be perfect. Because there's nothing more demoralizing than turning in something that you've worked on that you think is perfect, and then having us tell you it's really not perfect. So turn it in when it's done, and you'll be able to rewrite it once we've shown you what it is we're looking for. Okay? So also, I know most of you, has anyone never taken a course here before? Okay, good. So the extension school doesn't permit me to give you a lot of extra time when the semester is over. Things end, and I need to have everything in. But people do have things come up. Family issues, work issues, health issues, and you may have trouble getting something done by the end of the semester. If you feel that is going to happen, come to see me, because what we need to do is fill out a form, or you need to fill out a form called an extension of time form that needs to be submitted to the extension school office so they know I've given you permission to take more time. This is at the end of the semester. Don't wait until papers are due on December 15th and come and tell me you've had this trauma. but come and tell me beforehand so we can do this. Yes, sir.
You said the papers could be rewritten after the comments back. When's the due date if you rewrite them?
If you rewrite them, better to do it sooner than later, but I need to have everything in by December 15th. That's the absolute cutoff, okay? It's better. What's going to happen is this. You'll write your paper. Your grader will read it, return it to you probably in a week, maybe in 2 weeks, with the comments, okay? Then you're going to have another paper looming. Better for you to rewrite it while it's fresh in your mind. So rewrite it then. I don't have to say, okay, you have to get this next rewrite in by a certain date, just because a lot of people don't rewrite their papers. And maybe I should have a date when you have to get a rewrite in. But it's flexible, okay? So say within 2 weeks or so. But everything has to be in by December 15th. Don't wait until then. Say, okay, in early December I'll just start rewriting like mad. But rewrite as the semester is going along. And also let us know you're going to rewrite the papers. So suddenly on December 15th I don't get a pile of papers that you have rewritten. If you are rewriting, submit the original plus the rewrite so I know what it is you've done differently. Okay, I don't know if I've answered your question or if I've just talked a lot about this. Also, I have due dates here for the papers because in years past, and I don't want to hold you accountable for things other students have done, I've had students I've never heard of who suddenly show up at the end of the semester with a pile of papers, and it gets really annoying. So if you have to turn things in as the semester is going along, or you're penalized. So I think if by October 6th you have to have a paper in. The due date for the first paper is September 29th, okay? By the next week you have to have a paper in, or else the highest grade you're going to get in the course will be a B, even if it's the most brilliant paper I've ever read. That's it. Okay, then the next paper is due last class in October, and if you don't have at least 2 papers in by November 3rd, you're not going to get more than a B- in the class. Okay, and similarly, by December 15th, I have to have 3 papers in, or you're going to get a C+, unless you're getting an extension of time. And the extension of time, by the way, gives you, I think, an additional 6 weeks. So that gives you until middle of January. And it's a process involving lots of paperwork. So it's not, boy, if I get an extension of time, I can do a really good job over Christmas writing these papers. Harvard's just changed its schedule, so we're all getting used not only to being here in September, first week of September, but also being done by Christmas. So don't use the extension of time as a way to get extra time. We will see through such a shallow trick. And yes, sir.
Is that October 6th deadline mean the rewrite is due by then?
No, that just means the first paper. Okay, I take into account the due date is September 27th, but I've become experienced with human nature, and so I know people will say, well, that's a bad week for me because I just got this promotion and I have lots more work to do, or people have all kinds of reasons for not being able to do something at a certain time, but by the next week, yeah, not the rewrite. Okay? Any other questions on this? Yes?
So when do the one-page memos start being due? Is that next week?
The one-page memos start, let's say next week. Oh, I have to tell you, I got one from someone this morning. And so, yeah, next week. And hopefully by next week I'll have this website set up so that you can just submit them there. If not, bring them to class. And again, by the end of the semester, you should have done about 6 or 7 of these. Okay? So if you decide you want to write something for next week, then do it every other week, that's fine. If you decide you're going to wait for 2 weeks and then do an extra one at some point, that's fine. I'm not going to track you down and say, where is your memo for this week? But at the end of the semester, I'll look and say, okay, you did 6, you did 7, that's pretty good. You did none. Well, that's, she does better in the class than you do. Okay, I didn't mean to single you out. So that's just the way it works. I don't say, oh, gee, you did something on October 13th, but then you didn't do anything again until November 3rd. No, it's just we look and see, okay, you did all of these. They were pretty good. They were interesting. Okay. Any other questions on any of this? I hate to sound like, yes, sir.
So you don't, I'm sorry, are you allowed to write one rewrite or two?
I say you can do two. Don't tell Patrick or Chris I said you can do two, but yeah. And again, you should have a sense if you're only getting a marginal return on it. As I said, sometimes people take a paper that's already pretty good and try to improve it. And often rewriting isn't simply making a few cosmetic changes, although sometimes that is it. It really involves rethinking it in some way. And so it's not simply a matter of, okay, you said I had comma errors, I'll clean those up. Sometimes there is something else. And hopefully the grader will have pointed these things out to you so that you then can improve. And writing is a process. Some of you may be really good at simply writing something. I've never been really good at simply writing something. It takes me a lot of work to revise things and figure out how things should go. So writing is a process, and this is all part of it. It's one of the reasons we offer these classes, is so that you get experience in rewriting things, which is essential to the whole writing process. There are a couple of good books on writing that I will mention just while we're here. One is Strunk and White's book, The Elements of Style. I've always liked this book. I've read some essays recently by people who don't like the book, but they haven't convinced me. And since I'm teaching the class, this would be a good book to look at as far as figuring out how to write simple declarative sentences and put things clearly. The thing I really like is a guide to writing, especially in a course like this, is George Orwell's essay, Politics in the English Language. And once I figured out how to set things up on the website, I'll put this on it. Because it is all about political speech, which is something we'll be dealing a lot in. And a lot of times you're writing a course for a college and you think you need to sound really learned, and you wind up writing things that are really dull. And the last thing any of us wants to read is something that's dull, because this is really an exciting subject. And it's interesting because people are fighting over power, and they're fighting over the future. And that's really what we need to convey here. And so, has anyone read Politics in the English Language? Yes, the essay. Yes, it is an essay. It's a great essay, I think. And he takes different examples of political speech, really drawn from the 1940s. And you can see many of these same things happening, but the whole point is the English language has become debased by the use of euphemisms and vague speech and other things, and this leads to our thoughts becoming debased. Now, if you've read his novel like 1984, that's all about political speech, which is even more an issue now than it was in the 1940s, believe it or not. So, I'm sorry, I'm beginning to start hyperventilating as I go into a sermon about the demise of the language. And then there are other good books about writing, but the most important thing is to try to work out how to write. And you do that through the process of writing and rewriting, revising things. There's the great story Benjamin Franklin told at the end of as Congress was debating the Declaration of Independence. You probably know this, that Jefferson wrote the draft of the Declaration of Independence, and then it was submitted to the Congress to debate. And the members of Congress scrutinized it, going over it clause by clause, correcting things. And Jefferson was kind of a sensitive guy. and really felt that they were attacking him. It would be as though I took your paper and held it up and all of us debated it, saying, well, paragraph 3 really is kind of weak, and you would feel a little sensitive. And Benjamin Franklin, who probably was the best American writer in the 18th century and knew a lot about writing, told Jefferson a story, which is a great story about writing. A man named John Smith went into business selling hats, and he had a sign made up for his hat store, and it said, John Smith. Actually, it said, hats. Okay? John Smith, at this address, proposes to make hats and sell them for ready money. He's very proud of this sign that he had someone paint at great expense. And then he started showing it to his friends. And his first friend looked at it and said, why would you have a sign advertising hats, but it's at a different address? You don't need to say, at this address. It's going to be obvious. This is where you're selling hats. Shows it to another friend. He's disappointed, but he crosses that out. Some friend says, proposes to make hats. Are you going to do it, or aren't you going to do it? It makes sense. John Smith makes hats. You had to add an S, and sells them for ready money. Another friend looks at it and says, no one else in town who is in business is selling things for credit. Everyone expects cash. So it's not irrelevant to say, sell them for ready money. And so someone else looks at it and says, well, if I want to buy a hat, I really don't care who made the hat. What I want to know is where I can buy it. Well, that makes sense. So he takes out, makes hats, and simply has hats move down here. John Smith sells hats. His next friend says, sells hats? I wouldn't expect you to give the hats away. So he's left with a sign, and then another person says, you know, you have a picture of a hat. You don't really need to say hats. So what we're left with is the hat. And that's what good writing is. You take away everything that's irrelevant or unnecessary and just have the picture of the hat. Okay? So if you learn nothing else this semester, remember that. Okay? Are there any other questions? Okay, I think this will be a good time for us to call it a night, and when we come back next week, we'll talk about what begins to happen in the 1760s and 70s.